Good evening everyone, and welcome back. Tonight we're going deep into a quiet but very real storm that recently moved through the heart of the British royal family. It involves a set of pearls, a young princess, a queen consort, and a decision that reached all the way to the king himself. The story is more layered than it first appears, so settle in. This whole matter began, as so many of these things do, with something that looked small on the surface. A request was made. A piece of jewelry was identified. And then the paperwork started talking. What followed was not a public spectacle. It never made the front pages in the way people might expect. Instead, it stayed inside the private channels of the family, the household, and a few carefully guarded records. Yet the weight of it was unmistakable. Let's start with the pearls themselves. They are not just any strand. These particular pearls carry a clear line of intent that stretches back years. The documentation that William eventually brought forward was not dramatic or theatrical. It was precise. Jeweler records, inventory notes, and internal family instructions that had been written long before anyone expected a dispute. Those papers showed, without much room for interpretation, that the pearls had been designated for the young princess, not for temporary ceremonial use, not for rotation among senior women of the household. They were marked, in the quiet language of the household, as belonging to the next generation. William did not storm into a room waving papers. That is not how these things usually work. He simply made certain that the correct records were placed in front of the people who needed to see them. The jeweler's ledgers listed the pieces with the princess's initials already attached. The internal notes repeated the same designation. There was no ambiguity once the documents were laid side by side. The pearls were never intended for Queen Camilla's personal ceremonial rotation. That fact sat there in black and white. When the request had first been made, someone inside the household had already flagged the initials. The alert was not ignored by accident. It was noted, and still the request continued. That detail became the sharpest edge of the confrontation that followed. When William finally presented the full set of records, the reaction was immediate and physical. Camilla experienced a moment of genuine shock. Not the polite kind of surprise people offer in drawing rooms. Something more abrupt. The color drained, the posture stiffened. The room went quiet in the way rooms do when a truth lands harder than expected. It is worth pausing here to understand why the shock registered so strongly. These are not ordinary objects. Royal jewelry carries history, symbolism, and, more importantly, a sense of continuity. When a piece is marked for a child, it is more than an heirloom. It is a quiet statement about the future. To move that piece into another woman's personal rotation, even temporarily, touches something deeper than fashion or protocol. It touches the idea of who the jewelry is meant to serve across generations. King Charles reviewed the files himself. He did not delegate the final reading. The documents were placed in front of him, the jeweler records alongside the internal instructions, and the designation was upheld without hesitation. The pearls were ordered back into protected storage. That decision was clear and final. At the same time, Charles directed that a formal review of jewelry access procedures begin. The goal was simple: prevent future ambiguity. No more situations in which a request could proceed after an alert had already been raised. The systems needed tightening so that the next generation's pieces stayed clearly marked and clearly protected. The tension that followed was real. It sat in the air between the people involved. These are not strangers. They share the same houses, the same calendars, the same public duties. A quiet conflict of this kind does not stay neatly contained. It colors the silences. It changes the temperature of a room when certain people walk in. For a period of time, that temperature stayed elevated. What settled it was not a public statement or a carefully worded announcement. It was a private conversation between William and Camilla. The details of that conversation remain private, as they should. What is known is the outcome. Camilla withdrew the request. The pearls stayed where the documentation said they belonged. The immediate conflict cooled. That does not mean every feeling evaporated overnight. Families do not work that way. But the practical matter was closed. Let's step back and look at the wider pattern this episode sits inside. The royal family has always managed jewelry with a mixture of tradition, discretion, and occasional quiet friction. Pieces move between generations according to written and unwritten rules. Some items are locked to specific individuals by will or by long-standing instruction. Others rotate more freely. The difference between those two categories is usually clear to the people who handle the inventories every day. When that clarity is challenged, the system itself has to answer. In this case, the answer came from the records. The jeweler's notes were not new. They had existed for years. The internal family instructions were not invented for the moment. They had been written when the designation was first made. William's role was simply to make sure those existing papers were seen by the right eyes at the right time. Once they were seen, the path forward became obvious. There is a temptation, when stories like this surface, to turn them into larger dramas of personality or power. The truth is usually quieter and more procedural. A request was made. An alert was raised. The request continued anyway. Documentation was produced. A higher authority reviewed it. The original designation was confirmed. Access procedures were tightened. A private conversation closed the immediate disagreement. That sequence is the spine of what happened. Yet the emotional layer cannot be ignored. For Camilla, the shock was real. To be shown, in clear language, that a request had moved forward despite a specific warning about a child's initials is not a comfortable experience. For William, the motivation appears straightforward: protect the pieces already marked for his daughter. For Charles, the decision was institutional: uphold the written designation, then fix the process so the same uncertainty does not return. The review of jewelry access procedures is perhaps the most lasting practical result. Households of this size operate on layers of permission, inventory codes, and quiet understandings. When those layers allow a request to advance after an alert has been logged, the system has a gap. Closing that gap is the kind of quiet administrative work that rarely makes headlines but prevents future tension. It is the sort of change that protects the next set of designations before anyone has to argue about them. Public reaction, when fragments of the story eventually circulated in smaller circles, tended to split along familiar lines. Some saw the episode as evidence of overreach. Others saw it as a father simply defending what had already been assigned to his child. Both readings can exist at the same time because the facts themselves are not in serious dispute. The pearls were designated. The designation was challenged by a request. The designation was upheld. The request was withdrawn. What remains interesting is how little of this played out in public. No statements were issued. No photographs of the pearls appeared with new captions. The story stayed inside the private machinery of the family and the household. That containment is itself part of the culture. Certain conflicts are resolved without an audience. The audience only hears the echo later, if at all. The pearls themselves are now back in protected storage. Their future is clearer than it was a short time ago. They will wait for the young princess. The inventory notes that carry her initials remain attached. The jeweler records continue to list them under the same designation. Nothing about the physical objects has changed. What changed is the certainty surrounding them. In the days after the private conversation, the temperature between the two principals eased. That does not mean every underlying feeling disappeared. Families carry history, and history does not vanish because one request is withdrawn. But the specific conflict over these particular pearls reached a practical end. Camilla stepped back. William's evidence stood. Charles's decision held. There is a larger point worth sitting with. Objects that carry generational intent are never only objects. They become markers of continuity. When a set of pearls is written down for a child still growing up, the writing is a small act of faith in the future. Protecting that writing is therefore more than inventory management. It is a quiet defense of the idea that some things are meant to travel forward rather than sideways. The review of access procedures will take time. It will involve lists, codes, permissions, and the people who manage the day-to-day movement of these pieces. The goal is not punishment. The goal is clarity. Future requests will meet a tighter filter. Alerts already logged will carry more weight. Ambiguity will have fewer places to hide. For those who follow the family closely, this episode adds one more quiet data point to a long pattern. The current generation of parents is attentive to what is being set aside for their children. They read the inventories. They notice when designations are questioned. And when necessary, they bring the original paperwork into the light. That is essentially what happened here. William brought the paperwork. The paperwork spoke. Charles listened. The designation held. Camilla withdrew. The pearls returned to storage. A review was ordered. A private conversation closed the immediate circle. The story is not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There were no raised voices reported in corridors, no dramatic exits, no public scenes. The drama lived in the documents and in the brief, intense moment of recognition when those documents were placed in front of the person who had made the request. That moment of shock remains one of the most human details in the entire sequence. It reminds us that even inside institutions built on protocol, people still feel the sudden weight of being shown they have stepped across a line that was already drawn. In the weeks that followed, the household returned to its usual rhythms. Calendars filled. Appearances continued. The private matter stayed private. Yet the administrative change is already underway. Access to certain categories of jewelry will be handled with clearer checks. The initials that appear on inventory lists will carry more automatic protection. The next time a similar request is considered, the path will be shorter and the outcome more predictable. That, in the end, may be the most useful result. Not the temporary tension, not even the private conversation that eased it, but the quieter decision to make the system itself less ambiguous. When designations are clear and the process that protects them is tight, fewer moments of shock are required. The young princess will one day wear the pearls that were set aside for her. The records say so. The king confirmed it. The request that briefly challenged that future has been withdrawn. The storage remains locked. And somewhere inside the household the review of procedures continues, line by line, so that the next set of designations does not have to fight the same quiet battle. That is where the story rests for now. Not in public triumph or public defeat, but in a series of private decisions that protected a small, specific inheritance, and then tried to make sure the same uncertainty would not return. The pearls are safe. The designation is intact. The tension has eased. And the machinery that moves these objects from generation to generation has been told, gently but firmly, to tighten its grip on clarity. Thank you for staying with this one all the way through. These quieter episodes often reveal more about how the family actually works than the large public events ever do. The documents spoke. The people listened. And a set of pearls marked for a child remained exactly where they were always meant to be.